Movies are a visual medium. Without resorting to endless expository dialogue, filmmakers must use innovative ways to tell their story. This is doubly true in the horror genre, where a strong emotional reaction is the goal. In Halloween 2018, the subject of our previous episode, the story is told through exposition. Two webloggers are introduced at the start of the film in order to explain directly to the audience where the story is picking up. Later, another character explains away the abandoned brother-sister relationship between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. There's many more examples. The exposition is endless. A few weeks earlier, another slasher film was released to much less fanfare. A stark contrast to Halloween 2018, this movie used very little exposition and instead relied on complex visual storytelling. It might have sold a fraction of the tickets, but this superlative horror film deserves a much deeper look. Welcome to Hellfest. Hellfest is one of the few horror films in recent history that deserves not just our attention, but also our financial support. This video contains spoilers. As such, I'm asking viewers to support the film before watching my analysis. Rent it, stream it, buy it. If we want more movies like this, we need to vote with our wallets. Hellfest opens 1 year before the main action at a haunted attraction in the town of Orange Grove. 3 college-aged girls enter a haunted maze very near the closing time of the park. This mirrors the main storyline. This opening serves as a microcosm of the situation that'll follow, and allows the filmmakers to establish the later setting, character dynamics, and stakes. Although many films have done this before, such as the 2009 Friday the 13th reboot, there's an economy of screen time here that needs to be appreciated. It's during this prologue that we first hear the killer, a character known only as the Other, mumble a crude rendition of the Itsy Bitsy Spider. Spider imagery will reappear regularly throughout the movie. Right up front, though, the movie begins to develop its themes. The haunted house maze is a metaphorical spider's web. The victims are flies, and the other is the spider. Or is he? The first victim gets lost in the maze and is separated from her friends. From there, she finds herself in a room without an exit. She calls it a dead end. The other approaches her singing his song, but he doesn't attack, not until she challenges him. In particular, she flippantly says that he scared her and asks, is that what he wants to hear? At that point, the other stabs her. Still wheezing, she's hung from the rafters alongside mannequin props. The first fly is cocooned in the killer's web. Before we move on, it's important to mention that this pre-credit sequence serves a secondary purpose as well. Part of the culture of slasher movies usually involves an early sequence that sets up the motivations of the antagonist. Good examples of this are Prom Night and The Burning, early scenes that set up a motive. That's explicitly not what's happening here. This prologue is setting up the visual language of the film to come. It's not concerned with conveying plot, but rather setting the emotional expectations for the viewer. The Other is triggered by characters who do not respect their own fear. That's what's important. Our protagonist Natalie arrives at the apartment of her best friend from high school, Brooke. It's important to note that she's dropped off by a ride-sharing service. This small detail is important. Natalie doesn't own a car. She's greeted at the door by Brooke, who expresses surprise that Natalie came. There's an insinuation that the two have a long-standing Halloween tradition, one that Brooke didn't expect Natalie to honor. Natalie is surprised to discover that Taylor, a girl who teased her when they were younger, is now Brooke's roommate. The two exchange barbs, with Natalie noting that she's been distant because she's been studying in order to keep her scholarships. In short order, and inside dialogue that makes sense between the characters, the film has snuck in an important distinction. Natalie comes from a poor family, whereas Brooke and especially Taylor come from affluent backgrounds. This is an essential theme going forward, and I'll point it out wherever it appears. In a lesser film, this important dialogue would be handled with less care. Have you ever watched one of those crime scene television dramas? In seemingly every one, there's a scene where one investigator turns to another and says something like, "We'll send it out for DNA testing, should have the results by tomorrow," as if the second investigator wouldn't already know how long the testing would take. This is an example of ham-fisted exposition being delivered in dialogue that really is meant for the audience and not the characters being delivered to. Hellfest's script is meticulous about avoiding this. We also learn that Gavin, a boy from high school with whom Natalie shares a crush, has purchased VIP tickets for the entire group of friends. Here again, there's a subtle insinuation of wealth and privilege. How many 20-year-olds can afford to buy 6 VIP tickets to a seasonal attraction? especially considering that he can't even be certain that Natalie would show up. Compound this with Brooke asking Natalie if that's what she's going to wear. She says that Halloween is one night a year where girls can let out their inner slut, but watch the scene closely. Natalie's shirt is already unbuttoned to the third button. It's not about the amount of skin showing that Brooke is addressing. Natalie's off-the-rack shirt is replaced with a high-end top. Natalie, Brooke, her boyfriend Quinn, and Taylor arrive at Hellfest. As they approach the gates, Taylor and Quinn tell the story of the murder that occurred at the Orange Grove haunted attraction. We, the audience, saw this in the opening sequence, but Natalie and Brooke are unaware. The dialogue is not exposition. Instead, it allows the audience to contextualize what they've seen and apply it to the current situation on screen. The mirroring begins. The movie began with 3 girls entering a haunted house, and now we're watching another 3 at the same stage. Character dynamics are also slyly introduced here, as Taylor and Quinn tag team the ghost story. Their interaction is playful and warm, familiar. Although Quinn is Brooke's boyfriend, he shares a close relationship with Taylor, implying that Brooke became Taylor's roommate through Quinn. Most slasher films wouldn't bother with these kind of subtle character traits. But here, they help imprint the characters onto the viewer. We begin to care about these people. It feels natural. It's not clear how long they've been a couple, but Taylor greets Asher by leaping into his arms. This uncensored moment provides contrast to Natalie and Gavin's awkward embrace and halting conversation. Had the filmmakers simply shown their strained interactions without that quick glimpse into Taylor and Asher's relationship, it wouldn't be as easy to sympathize with Natalie. This small character beat might seem insignificant and fleeting, but actually, this is the movie showing its audience how it'll weave its concepts into its narrative. We'll be shown normal moments in order to appreciate the abnormal. The viewer isn't asked to be uncomfortable without first knowing what comfortable looks like. Too often in modern horror movies, we're inundated with scary visuals and jump scares, but because we have no point of reference, they have zero impact. Take a good look at this overhead view of the park. The raised platform in the center, the walkways that lead towards it from every direction, the string lights that illuminate the pathways. Do you see the rough shape of a spiderweb? The next character we meet enters the park just behind our group of protagonists. The camera stays behind him and we never get a view of his face. Bear McCreary's musical score takes on a dissonant, uneasy, and discordant tone. We immediately know we're watching the villain, the other. Clean haircut and dressed in a common hoodie and jeans, we're also given our first indication that this monster is outwardly normal, which mirrors the description Taylor jokingly gave just moments before. No need for him to kick a dog or pop a kid's balloon. Instead, after such an open introduction to our 3 college-aged couples, the intentional obscurity of his identity conveys everything the viewer needs to know. But a good deal more is being told to the viewer in this brief scene. And besides 2 words from a security guard, it's all done without dialogue. The images on screen are doing the work. First, we're shown a reasonable level of security at the park. Guests all must go through a metal detector and are further scanned down with a metal detecting wand. Hellfest isn't artificially placing the characters in a contrived situation where they're unsafe. Second, we're told how we can identify the killer. Since park employees will also wear masks, we're shown that he wears a ragged pair of work boots with the steel toe exposed on the right foot. This will help the story's hard mechanics later, but think about it for a moment. It's one thing that the characters might eventually suss this out as a method for identifying him, but the fact that the filmmakers are choosing to give this information to the viewer up front, in the beginning, is telling. Some movies treat their audience as carnival rubes, that is, someone to be manipulated. Think about those films you've seen where the twist ending is completely impossible to guess because the filmmakers didn't set it up. This movie takes the opposite tact and instead takes pains not to hide information. It's not talking down to its viewers, but inviting them into the storytelling. This technique is essential to building suspense. The 3 couples' first stop is the Fear Garden, the park's bar where they do shots. This introduces the hypodermic needle as a totem in the film in a creative and inventive fashion. As they discuss their plans for the evening, it becomes obvious that Natalie's the outsider of the group of friends. Brooke, Quinn, Taylor, Asher, and Gavin are all on board for the scariest attractions the park has to offer, but Natalie is reluctant. Since everyone tends to feel insecure in unusual groups of people, the audience is nudged to feel sympathy with her. It's important to note that a small bit of exposition is smuggled in here when it's mentioned that in order to get to Hell Maze, the scariest attraction, you must enter through the Deadlands. How it's mentioned, however, is organic. Natalie wouldn't know this, so her being told is not in the same league as those crime scene investigator shows. Meanwhile, Outside the fear garden, the other watches a young woman named Brittany rebuff a costumed actor who attempts to scare her. Putting on his mask and, at the same time, losing his identity to the crowd, he makes a beeline for Brittany and bumps up against her. She asks him if he thinks that he's scary and answers her own question with "No, move." The viewer remembers the film's cold open and makes the connection. The other targets park patrons who paid an expensive ticket price to be scared but then spend their time pretending not to be affected. He seems to have a Halloween variation of the old "Keep Christ in Christmas" meme. To the other, dishonoring the intent of Halloween is worthy of a death penalty. In broad terms, he's a fundamentalist who punishes apostates. More specifically, he imprints his death sentence on hypocrites who devalue his chosen holiday. As they move through the Devil's Carnival, a demon clown-themed midway, Gavin warns Natalie that the more she seems frightened of the costume actors, the more they'll try and scare her. Think about how this scene reflects the one that immediately precedes it. Gavin's advice comes from a position of privilege. He can afford to buy tickets for all of his friends and pretend not to be scared. Natalie has no such luxury. We sense that she would never spend money on something she doesn't even want to enjoy. The collision of these two ideas, the other's moral extremism, and the cultural ramifications of economic status, form the thematic framework that Hellfest is built upon. The first attraction is Deform School, a haunted maze themed after a Catholic high school taken over by demons. Natalie, of course, is derisively nicknamed Grade School by Taylor. That these girls have a shared history in grade, middle, and high school is not incidental. The story in the park is paralleling their characters. As they approach the haunted house, they bypass the line by showing their passes. In an obvious evoking of economic class, Taylor taunts the regular admission patrons by shouting, "VIP, bitches, sucks to be you." Once inside, Brooke remarks that the last thing I need to do is relive high school. But high school is the point at which Brooke and Natalie were closest. Natalie is once again subtly being made an outcast, even by her best friend. Why? Based on earlier dialogue, simply because she couldn't afford as expensive a college as Brooke and Taylor. Wandering Deform School's hallways, the group effectively breaks off into couples. As they are frightened by costume actors leaping out of doorways, Gavin offers another bit of advice. Look at their hands. Natalie does, and quickly is able to identify which figures are mannequins and which are real people. Of course, what the movie's really doing is telling us to pay attention to the other's shoes, which are easily discernible from the theme park's employees' sneakers. In a less well-developed movie, this dialogue would have been delivered absolutely on the nose or not provided at all. Here, it's smart and subtle and respects the audience. Once she has this method, Natalie relaxes and begins to examine how the mazes work. This skill is introduced here so that later, in more dire circumstances, it feels natural and earned. Hellfest is also using these scenes to introduce us to another piece of its internal logic. The movie's jump scares all occur inside the haunted attractions by the park employees. When the other shows up, and later as he stalks our characters, he never pops into frame with a boo. His presence instead is deliberate and seemingly omnipresent. There's been a glut of horror movies over the last few decades that rely on cheap jump scares for their bread and butter. Hellfest openly criticizes that technique. Here, as the final girls come face to face with the other, he walks slowly into the Deform School classroom. Without any quick movements, he studies them. Natalie breaks his cardinal rule by telling him, "You're not scary, dude," which guarantees that she's the next to be stalked. When he pulls Brittany out of her hiding spot, his eyes are on Natalie. Thinking it's all part of the show, she tells him to do it. And he does, plunging an ice pick into her abdomen. The audience understands the rules and suddenly feels dread for Natalie. She's trespassed into a very dangerous position. Think back for a moment to the slasher films of the past. Can you remember any time when the killer and victim's motivations have been this expertly conveyed to the viewer?